You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Quick reminder off the top to please go and hit that like button, comment down below, and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube if you haven't done so already, all of which is 100% free, will not cost you anything, and is the best way to show support and help me continue to grow the channel over here on Locked On Blackhawks. All right, happy Tuesday, everyone. Thank you all again for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Our knight in shining armor, Blackhawks fans, just 48 hours after being acquired from the Florida Panthers in exchange for defenseman Seth Jones, Spencer Knight made his team debut for the Blackhawks. And what a team debut it was, stopping 41 of the 42 shots that he faced to backstop his new team to a 5-1 victory. He was phenomenal all night long, particularly, though, in the opening 20 minutes where I'm sure it was a quick slap in the face to Spencer being like, oh, yeah, I'm no longer a part of the defending Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers. His last start with Florida, by the way, he faced 18 shots in that game. That's precisely what he faced in the opening 20 minutes of this one against the Los Angeles Kings. But he was outstanding right from the opening faceoff, made 17 saves in the opening 20 minutes. As I mentioned, winds up with 41 saves on the night. Was really solid, I thought, too. Down the stretch in the final few minutes when the Kings did have the extra attacker out looking for a comeback effort. And I was really impressed as well with just Spencer Knight's composure altogether. He didn't look like he was frantic in the net or anything. He stayed really solid. Positionally, I thought he was very good. I really liked how he was able to play the puck, and we heard several members of the Blackhawks that were interviewed during this game, and also I think it was Derek King, maybe, who was interviewed during the second intermission. Can't remember exactly if he was the one who brought it up, but just altogether, the confidence in Spencer Knight's game definitely stood out to me, as well as just the confidence for him to tell the coaching staff and talk to Kyle Davidson and Anders Sorensen and say, yeah, I'm ready to go. I'll be able to start this game despite being traded less than 48 hours ago. So I love the confidence, the poise, and the belief out of Spencer Knight. And oh yeah, Blackhawks fans, don't forget, this kid's still only 23 years old and not going to turn 24 until next month in April. And here's an interesting statistic. He's actually 3 days younger than Calgary Flames goaltender Dustin Wolf, who's in the Rookie of the Year running as of right now. Spencer Knight, obviously has had a different first few years compared to Dustin Wolf. Spencer's been on the stage for a long, long time, but age-wise, he's right there with Dustin Wolf. So definitely something we got to keep in mind. A ton of great experiences and exposure for Spencer Knight at a young age during his time with the Florida Panthers. And now that he's going to be a focal point of the rebuild here in Chicago, not that his development, like I mentioned yesterday, wasn't important for Florida, but it wasn't priority number one as they're in win now mode, trying to go back-to-back as Stanley Cup champions. Spencer Knight's development is going to be a focal point here in Chicago. He's going to be a priority. And I really liked as well to hear his post-game interview with Darren Pang after being named the number one star of the game. Said all the right things. Blackhawks fans seem to already love this kid. Heck of a performance from Spencer Knight in his team debut. Excited to see him throughout the remainder of the season, hopefully for a long, long time, as we hope he's going to be the goaltender of the future here for the Blackhawks. But not only was Spencer Knight great last night, I thought the Blackhawks were really solid in the final 40 minutes of this game to pick up a nice team victory. Sure, if you go and look at the numbers, they got outshot by a hefty margin once again, 42-19. The analytics won't look great, but I really thought they tightened things up, especially compared to how loose they were in the opening 20 minutes and how much they had to lean on Spencer Knight early. But I thought defensively they were much more structured in those final two periods. I loved the physicality out there, especially from Colton Dach, who I'll be talking more about here in segment 2. But I love that Colton Dach has finally picked up on he needs to be just a dog off the leash out there on the ice. And that's what he's been for the most part over his last couple of stints. He is just an absolute brick out there, throwing reverse hits. Guys try to go and run into him, and they're just not able to knock him down. I absolutely love that stuff out of Colton Dach, but I thought the physicality was excellent out of the Blackhawks last night. The shot blocking was really good. I think something that didn't really get mentioned, but was very crucial in helping the Blackhawks stay ahead in those final two periods was them staying out of the penalty box. Only 2 penalty minutes in this game for the Blackhawks. And then they also got some nice run support for a third consecutive game. Believe it or not, Blackhawks fans, we've now scored 5 goals in 3 straight games, and Ryan Donato and Teuvo Teravainen continue to be at the helm of any offensive success that this team has. Donato with another goal, the empty netter, and an assist last night for a 2-point performance. That extends his point streak to 5 games. Teuvo Teravainen added another 2 assists as well last night. His point streak is up to 5 games. And Donato, since January 18th, has been on an amazing run. He's now got 21 points, 9 goals, and 12 assists over his last 16 games. Teravainen has been even better, really, since the middle of December. Over his last 31 contests, Teuvo is up to 35 points. That's 13th in the NHL during that stretch, tied with Connor McDavid. So Teuvo has been producing regularly, basically since Anders Sorensen stepped in as the interim head coach. But with Connor Bedard remaining off the stat sheet last night again, Blackhawks fans, despite the team potting 5 goals for a third consecutive game, this now makes 6 straight games without a point for number 98. His worst stretch of the season, undoubtedly, even though there were a lot of hiccups to begin the campaign. I wonder if it's just time you got to give him Ryan Donato and Teuvo Teravainen. It's been a rotating door up there for Bedsy. They've been trying to give him Donato. They've been mixing Slaggert up there. They've been mixing Frank Nazar. I think to just get the kid going and get him out of this frustrating stretch. I'm sure he's happy that the team just won back-to-back games, by the way, for only the 3rd time this season and the first since mid-December. But you know that he wants to be producing on top of that. And it's just been a frustrating season as a whole for Connor Bedard, even though he is still the Blackhawks' leading scorer. Teuvo Teravainen is starting to cut down on that gap, and I feel like him and Bedard just have not played together much at all this season, especially since Teuvo's been on this nice run since December 15th. I think it's time to put Teuvo back on the top line with Bedsy. I know he's been rolling with Mikheyev, and they like using those two with Foligno when he's healthy to create a shutdown pairing. But guess what? Priority number 1 is the kids, and Connor Bedard certainly is at the top of that list. You got to get him going here in these final 21 games of the season. You don't want any frustration to linger over into the offseason. Let's try to get him to a nice finish to the 2024-25 regular season. I think it's time to put Teuvo Teravainen up on that top line with him, considering how strong Teuvo has been for the last 2.5 months now. But there is everything I have from a rare second consecutive victory for the Chicago Blackhawks. Fun night last night at the United Center, 5-1 win over the Los Angeles Kings. Good stuff from Ryan Donato, good stuff from Teuvo Teravainen. Ilya Mikheyev had himself another 2-point performance as well. Lucas Reichel picked up a point for the second consecutive game, but undoubtedly the number 1 star was Spencer Knight, stopping 41 of 42 shots in his team debut. We'll see if he's back in there when the Blackhawks return to action tomorrow night against the Ottawa Senators. But coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, with Spencer Knight now in the picture, I'll talk about what Petr Mrazek's future looks like ahead of Friday's NHL trade deadline. Real quick, though, Blackhawks fans, I got to talk to you all about a relatively new sponsor here on the Locked On Podcast Network, which is Wonderful Pistachios. Are you looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Well, then crack into a great source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. And Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts out there, as each 1-ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily nutritional value. Plus, they're packed with fiber, and they're better for you than unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. So whether you're running between meetings or just dropping off the kids at school, Wonderful Pistachios are the snack that works as hard as you do. So get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch by visiting wonderfulpistachios.com in order to learn more. Again, that's wonderfulpistachios.com to check it out today. Segment 2 with Spencer Knight now stepping into the frame along with Arvid Soderblom and Petr Mrazek. The Blackhawks have a little bit of a predicament on their hands. Not one that they can't solve, but I'm interested to see how they are going to go about solving it, and it feels like they might have to make a move they don't necessarily want to make. To kind of explain this on the show here today, Blackhawks fans, let's dive into the current active roster. Looking at the Blackhawks active roster right here, right now, they have 13 forwards, everyone who played last night, along with Nick Foligno, who wasn't able to go due to a back injury. But then, along with those 13 forwards, Andreas Athanasiou, of course, is part of that. Colton Dach, those two guys just got recalled from Rockford. But Jason Dickinson and Philip Kurashev are currently on injured reserve. Jason Dickinson actually was seen skating by Charlie Roumeliotis of WGN prior to the Blackhawks morning skate yesterday. So it seems like Jason Dickinson is trending in the right direction. We heard when the Hawks got back from the Four Nations faceoff that he was probably 2 to 3 weeks away. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Jason Dickinson start rejoining the team in practice in the next week or so. But that's something to keep in mind. 13 forwards plus Dickinson and Kurashev, who's on IR right now as well. Then there's 7 defensemen on the active roster after Louis Crevier was recalled, along with Wyatt Kaiser. Ethan Del Mastro, of course, is up at the NHL level as well. The 6 guys who played last night plus TJ Brody as the extra, that gives the Hawks 7 defensemen. 13 plus 7, that equals 20. And then we go to the goaltender position, and the Hawks, of course, have Spencer Knight. Boy, oh boy, am I stoked that they have Spencer Knight. I had to pinch myself last night. I still can't believe it's real. But they have Spencer Knight, Arvid Soderblom, and Petr Mrazek. 13 plus 7 plus 3, that equals 23. Blackhawks fans. You see where I'm going here. You can only have 23 players on an active roster at one point in time. So whenever Jason Dickinson or Philip Kurashev should return, whoever comes first, kind of seems like Dickinson is more likely, but not 100% sure on the seriousness of Philip Kurashev's injury. I do wonder, just because of the roster situation, if they happen to place him on IR. But whenever one of those two, again, whoever it is first, Dickinson or Kurashev, return from IR, what happens to the Blackhawks active roster? Now, you can start with the defensemen, since they have Crevier, Del Mastro, and Kaiser up at the NHL scene right now. They could, send one of those guys down. Probably not Louis Crevier, in my opinion, because with Seth Jones gone now, there's a need for right-handed defensemen. He and Connor Murphy are the only 2 righties left on the NHL roster. So, yeah, you could send down one of, Ethan Del Mastro or Wyatt Kaiser. I think that makes sense. However, that would leave the team with only 6 active defensemen on the roster. So going to the forward group for a potential solution, which I think is the most likely option, but also difficult at the same point in time, you could send Colton Dach back down to the Rockford Ice Hogs, even though I know they don't want to do it. It is an option, but with Colton Dach coming off of a really solid game last night against the Kings, a great play to force a turnover and set up Andreas Athanasiou for his first NHL goal of the season and first NHL goal since April of last year. Don't really think you want to be sending Colton Dach down, especially after I just referenced during segment 1, the physicality and the edge and chippiness that he's been playing with recently. Like, he's fully gotten the memo and has been displaying it on the ice. I don't think it would be fair to send Colton Dach down, but again, it's not really about what's fair. It's about what the Blackhawks can actually do. I don't think they want to do that, but it is an option. They could send Andreas Athanasiou back down to the Rockford Ice Hogs as well. No one's going to be picking him up at the $4.5 million price tag that he's got attached to him for the remainder of the season. But I do think Athanasiou's speed is much needed in this Blackhawks forward group. Those 2 things are definitely in the cards, but what I think really could be the solution for the Blackhawks here prior to Friday is they trade either Ryan Donato or Craig Smith in order to get a spot open. I talked yesterday during my final Blackhawks trade deadline preview about my opinion on Ryan Donato. Last thing I'll say on it on today's show is, while I wouldn't be upset if Ryan Donato didn't get traded, like, he's definitely a great player because of his age, because of the value, I think it only makes sense for the Blackhawks to get as best of a return as they can for a guy who's having kind of an outlier type of season. So trading one or both of those guys, quite honestly, would open up the necessary roster spots that I think the Blackhawks want to have down the stretch of the season. Then you also have to someone like Ryan Green signing his ELC, someone like Oliver Moore signing his ELC, Dominic James, I talked about on yesterday's show. The Blackhawks are planning to sign him to his entry-level contract as well. So you see the predicament here, Blackhawks fans. The team just has a couple bodies too many, and that's why, some of the signings I don't think necessarily made sense. Having all of them, like signing Craig Smith and Pat Maroon, just didn't really make all that much sense. Signing Alec Martinez and TJ Brody just didn't really make all that much sense. So I think the easiest solution for the Blackhawks here is to probably trade Ryan Donato or Craig Smith. However, what I want to be sure to bring up before jumping over into segment 3 to close out today's show is Petr Mrazek, because at some point in time, whether it's at this year's deadline or in the summer, the Blackhawks are going to have to figure out their goaltender situation now that Spencer Knight is officially in the frame, because Petr Mrazek and Laurent Brossoit are both under contract for next year. Arvid Soderblom is going to be a pending restricted free agent, but he's going to take priority over those other guys, considering he could be part of the future here in Chicago. The Blackhawks, I'm sure, would love to trade Petr Mrazek before this Friday's deadline to give them just the regular 2 goalies on their NHL roster. However, there's a lot of complications involved in getting a Petr Mrazek deal done. First off, he's been really bad since basically October. He had an .821 save percentage in the month of December and an .850 save percentage last month in February. He's now down to .890 on the season, has not looked anything like the guy he was, who was one of the most underappreciated goalies in the entire NHL last season. And again, he's still got 1 year left on his current deal at $4.5 million and is 33 years old. And with the Hawks not having a salary retention spot for the rest of the year because they had to retain on Seth Jones, it's very, very unlikely. It's not going to happen. I'll just come out and say that. Another team is going to pay $4.5 million for Petr Mrazek, considering he has another year on that deal. If the Blackhawks wanted to move him at this year's deadline, I feel like they'd probably have to give up an asset in order to move him. And they're not backed that far in a corner. As I said, they have solutions. Sending Colton Dach down, sending Andreas Athanasiou down. Do they want to do that? No, but it's probably better than trading Petr Mrazek and giving up an asset in order to do so before this year's deadline. But regardless if it happens, before Friday, I don't think it happens, but I said the same thing about Seth Jones, so you never know. But regardless if it's before the deadline or in the summer, the Blackhawks are going to have to find a way to move on from Petr Mrazek, because there's just no room for him, considering they have Spencer Knight and Arvid Soderblom. Drew Commesso, who I know has just kind of been surpassed by Knight here, is still waiting in the wings. There's just no real room for Petr Mrazek or Laurent Brossoit at this point in time. So I think something's going to have to go down during the summer, because I don't see any way the Blackhawks wind up getting a deal done before Friday to move on from Petr Mrazek, as much as they would like to just be left with Spencer Knight and Arvid Soderblom on their roster. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Blackhawks are probably going to be forced to stick with 3 NHL goaltenders for the remainder of the season. Laurent Brossoit continues to be an absolute ghost. I doubt he's going to play this year, and gotta wonder at this point if he's ever going to suit up for the Chicago Blackhawks. What an absolute nightmare that has been. But I think the real solution for the Blackhawks to get the roster down to the numbers they need is trading Ryan Donato and probably Craig Smith as well. They just need both of those spots open again for who they have right here, right now, with Dickinson and Kurashev going to come off IR at some point, as well as Oliver Moore and all the college prospects like Ryan Green and Dominic James, maybe even Aiden Thompson, who could be signing ELCs when their college seasons come to a close to make their NHL debuts with the Chicago Blackhawks. But there is everything I have on Petr Mrazek's future with the Blackhawks and the team's active roster. Just don't see any way this gets done before Friday. But I said the same thing about Seth Jones, so we'll just have to wait and see. Coming up in just a moment, though, Blackhawks fans, before I close out today's episode, still got to get into our Mailbag Monday fan segment, but on Tuesday. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen. Here to start off your day. For your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On NHL podcast, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter with the local coverage you love from Locked On. And you can easily find Locked On NHL right now on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Segment 3, Mailbag Monday, but on Tuesday this week with the Spencer Knight news going down over the weekend. That was on the forefront of yesterday's show. Make sure to go in, check out yesterday's show if you haven't already, to get my full initial reaction on the Blackhawks landing Spencer Knight and a conditional first-round pick in exchange for defenseman Seth Jones. Mailbag Monday gets pushed over to Tuesday. We'll be back to the normal scheduled programming next week, though, Blackhawks fans, I promise. But a reminder, if you are watching right here, right now, and have a question that you want yours truly to answer this time on the show next week, drop them down below in the comment section. Can also reach out in the review section if you're tuning in through an audio platform, or you can also email lockdownblackhawks@gmail.com. First question I wanted to answer today comes from Andy Alum 4357, who asked, question, if you could have kept either DeBrincat or Hagel without losing the trade benefits, who would you choose? Very, very interesting question, because now with the preference of this question, or with the way it was written, I can ignore, the fact that we wouldn't have gotten Connor Bedard if we happened to keep these guys. Alex DeBrincat versus Brandon Hagel. It's a really, really good question. DeBrincat obviously has the higher goal scoring upside and is more of a power play guy, but give me Brandon Hagel, man. A guy who can absolutely do it all, is made for playoff hockey. Maybe I'm crazy, but I'm going to take Brandon Hagel over Alex DeBrincat. I just think Alex being undersized, I know it's not really fair to say this because he doesn't have much playoff experience, but I just don't know if his game is made for playoff success, where I kind of know that about Brandon Hagel, and I know he can produce offensively on top of it. So I'm going with Hagel. Next question comes from Darren Wilcox 4683, who asked, do you think a trade with Reichel is imminent, with AA being brought up from Rockford? Probably to take Foligno's spot. Feel bad for the guy. Still think he's got some promise. I actually think AA was brought up to potentially play with Lukas Reichel. That hasn't been the case thus far. And in game one, of AA coming back, he was on the top line with Connor Bedard, which I think shows you just how dire things have been for the Chicago Blackhawks. But I would like to see Athanasiou get a stretch with Lukas Reichel. They've showed some good chemistry in the past. I don't think bringing AA up was a sign that they're shopping Lukas Reichel whatsoever. But as I've mentioned on the show a couple of times, if other GMs are making calls to Kyle Davidson about Lukas Reichel, I think he's answering. I don't know if he's necessarily dialing the phone to other GMs looking to trade him, but if other GMs are making calls, Lukas Reichel could be on the move at this year's deadline. I had him number 2 on my Blackhawks big board behind only Ryan Donato. Next question comes from PHHDVM, who asked, for the mailbag, if you were in charge, would you be willing to part with both of this year's first round picks to land a premier talent forward in the offseason? Well, it's kind of hard to think about which talent forward necessarily comes to mind. There's not one listed here. Just as a vague question, I'd probably say no. I think the Blackhawks really want to be picking in the top couple of this year's draft in order to get a good forward prospect along with Connor Bedard. Yes, having an established forward to help right here, right now would be great as well, but I don't think it has to be an either-or situation. The Blackhawks can still go address that in the offseason and take whatever forward they want inside the top 4 of this year's draft. I don't think it has to be an either or. Next question comes from Isaac Guerrero, 8873, who asked, question for the mailbag, which free agent should we target July 1st with $7 million per year over 5 years that the Hawks save by trading Jones? I don't know precisely about the terms of that deal, but obviously, there's going to be lots of rumors about the Blackhawks maybe having interest in Mikko Rantanen and Mitch Marner, the 2 big-name forward free agents in this year's class. And again, like the Blackhawks going forward with likely whatever pick they have in the 2025 NHL draft, they're going to be addressing forward, I believe, with whatever next big free agent signing they have. Should it not be Mikko Rantanen and Mitch Marner, who obviously will require much more than the $7 million per year over 5 years, like you're mentioning here, Isaac? I don't know if these guys would fit in that category either. Probably not, because of the way the salary cap is going to rise. But I do think 2 forwards who could be interesting at not top-tier dollar like Rantanen or Marner. Nikolai Ehlers, I know he's a little bit older at this stage, but I do think he could be interesting. And I think Brock Besser as well from the Vancouver Canucks. Those are 2 forwards a tier down from Rantanen and Marner that I think the Blackhawks could show interest in this offseason. Next question comes from Gil Hansen, 6156, who asked, Now that Florida has Jones, who will they have a tough time re-signing? Looking at their Puckpedia, which is now the new website that I use for all the salary cap maneuvers and all the information. RIP to Cap Friendly, which was my favorite website of all time. Puckpedia still does a very good job as well. Took a look at the Florida Panthers Puckpedia before jumping on today's show. Sam Bennett is an unrestricted free agent this summer, so that's going to be tough for them to afford. Aaron Ekblad is an unrestricted free agent, but I think everyone in the Panthers realm kind of knew that bringing in Seth Jones meant it was the end of Aaron Ekblad. So those are the two big name guys who are set to come off the books this year. Nate Schmid is another one, but as an aging veteran who, wasn't like necessarily part of the core like Ekblad or Sam Bennett have been these last handful of years. Probably not as noteworthy, but yeah, Ekblad and Bennett looks like are two potential casualties for the Florida Panthers after this season. Last question that I have comes from Eric Borch 1678. And again, a reminder, drop your questions down below on YouTube if you're watching right now. With the Seth trade, do you see Petr and Arvid being moved? Petr Mrazek, absolutely. Like I said, if it doesn't happen at this year's deadline, I think it has to happen during the offseason. Even if the Blackhawks have to, maybe they don't want to retain, but only Connor Murphy, I feel like, is the one guy they would have to retain on at next year's deadline. But again, I'm sure Kyle Davidson would like to have options. But even if they have to retain, I think the Blackhawks somehow, some way, got to find how to get Petr Mrazek off their books. Arvid Soderblom, no way. They got to keep him, especially as a restricted free agent with all the promise he's shown this year. He and Spencer Knight could be a deadly 1-2 tandem in goal between the pipes for the Blackhawks for a long, long time. Do not see Arvid Soderblom being moved. Petr Mrazek and Laurent Brossoit, I think both of their days are numbered with the Blackhawks. Not that, there was ever a number counter being started for Laurent Brossoit, as he basically has never been on the ice with the Blackhawks except for a couple practices, maybe. I don't even know if that's true. It's been a nightmare with Laurent Brossoit, but that's going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks, everyone. As always, thank you all again for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free right now, wherever you may be listening to your podcasts, and to go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. That way, you can get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your Tuesdays. I'm going to be on the road these next handful of days, so apologies if my audio or video quality isn't as good as it normally is when I'm in the standard studio, but bear with me. I'm heading down to Florida to have hopefully a good chat with Armando Velez from Locked On Panthers about this trade. Be on the lookout for that, Blackhawks fans. But until tomorrow's episode, I'll catch you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.